academic institutions are such conservative institutions that value excellence and meritocracy. Some people can see anyone be given some kind of special dispensation or special accommodation as taking away from excellence or taking away from true meritocracy. And I think understanding that equity is just factoring in the differences amongst people to ensure equal opportunity of success and is not necessarily a personal affront or is giving someone more than you is really important.
Hello and welcome to the Future of Universities podcast series. My name is Rimanta Rushaite, Senior Project Officer at UIIN, and I'm your host for today. In this episode, I had a conversation with my colleague Madeline Arkins, who's also a Project Officer, about equity, diversity and inclusion in European higher education. Madeline shares insights on the barriers underrepresented groups face in academic leadership and the role of data in driving change. Tune in to hear practical strategies and inspiring examples of institutions working towards more inclusive future in higher education.
Today I have a pleasure of speaking with Madeline Arkins, who is my colleague here at UIIN at the research and project team. And the topic is on the state of equity, diversity and inclusion, EDI, in European higher education, and how to foster more inclusive leadership and create meaningful change within academia. A little introduction on Madeline. She's my colleague, as I mentioned. She's an experienced researcher in equity, diversity and inclusion and coordinates the Erasmus EU Lead for All project that focuses specifically on this topic. She holds an MSc in Sociology from Erasmus University in Rotterdam and a BA in English Literature from Trinity College Dublin. Madeline, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Romante. Thank you for the introduction. It's lovely to be here.
Shall we start?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Could you build a little bit more on your background and what initially drew you to the work on this very important topic and specifically in higher education sector?
Sure. So as you said, my background began in arts and humanities, and then I pivoted to sociology. And in my master's, I had a focus on inequalities, specifically racial inequality in the housing policy. And I really enjoyed the research element of that. And that's what drew me to UIIN. I've been at UIIN now for just over 2 years, and this research initiative that we'll be talking about today is a really nice marriage of both my research interest in higher education and also the important topic of EDI. And I've had the pleasure of coordinating this research initiative for the last year with 4 other partner universities and organizations. And it's tackling the really important topic in higher education, and one that is really immediately felt, I think, when you look at institutions today. We have more diverse students than ever before as a result of different widening participation policies, but we really don't see that same increase in diversity and representation at leadership level. And how is it that can happen, and what can we do to make changes in the system?
As I understand, you are just kicking off this project and you've done the research part. So based on that work so far, what is your perspective on the current stage of equity, diversity and inclusion in maybe specifically European higher education realm?
Yeah, so we're about a year into the project, and we did this research phase at the beginning of the year, and that was your typical literature review, and we did some interviews with a variety of different profiles across both Europe and outside. So it ended up being about 56 interviews, and these were both with top leadership at universities, so your provosts, your deans, vice rectors, and then also what we call, in the project at least, aspiring leaders from underrepresented groups. So these are early mid-career academics or professional staff from underrepresented groups. And I'll very quickly define this term because I fear I'll be using it throughout. This is an umbrella term and is by no means an exhaustive list, but it refers to those who are less represented in higher education leadership than they are in wider society. And that includes women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, members of the LGBTQ+ community, those with disabilities, non-nationals, as in their institution, non-nationals, and those from a lower socioeconomic background or first-generation students. A wide net was cast in terms of our interviewees, and yeah, so the research comes from that. In terms of my perspective on the current state To give credit where credit is due, it has certainly made great strides, most of all, I would say, in the realm of gender equality. And this is something we heard a lot through our interviews, is that, yes, there has been great progress made. Just using the example of Ireland in the last 10 years, that's two top universities, Trinity College Dublin and University College Dublin, both now have female heads. But that effort, I would say, in that realm overshadows a lot of the challenges that many other underrepresented groups are still facing in terms of reaching their leadership ambitions at universities. Maybe the over prevalence on gender is certainly something that has come up a lot in the research, but also, maybe one significant point is the misunderstanding or kind of misalignment among different people about what EDI work is and what, in fact, equity means and how it differs from equality. And we heard this particularly from current leadership who, I mean, it also takes a lot to say, I don't understand what that concept means. This concept that I'm supposed to champion and to put my word in and strategic plans about what that means to this institution. So it's really important that people admit when they don't know and also have that curiosity to find out. Because academic institutions are such traditional, often deemed conservative institutions that value excellence and meritocracy, some people can see anyone be given some kind of special dispensation or special accommodation as taking away from excellence or taking away from true meritocracy. And I think understanding that equity is just factoring in the differences amongst people to ensure equal opportunity of success and is not necessarily a personal affront or is giving someone more than you is really important, and is some fundamental training I think is needed in order to really make that cultural shift in institutions.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess it transcends higher education sector, but in that field, it's so important because it's foundational to our societies. Now, so I guess that is like a good segue into talking about more challenges or barriers. Maybe you could name a few of other that you came across that underrepresented groups face. And thank you so much also for explaining what that actually means.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Ramanta, anytime. So what could also be useful is maybe to describe what the framework we developed in the research, because I think that kind of helps give a visual aid, even though this is an audio medium, in that it structures the process or the pipeline, so to speak, of how people enter the university, how they're recruited maybe as students or as staff members, how they are promoted or retained to higher positions, and then how they make their way up to leadership level, and what challenges or hurdles they may encounter at every step, and indeed what supporting mechanisms exist currently or could exist to alleviate that process or make it a more equitable and fair process for all involved. And there are many a hurdle. It's often called a leaky pipeline towards leadership, in that you may encounter low representation, but you also have the issue of high attrition rates. So that even if there are inclusive recruitment practices, if you don't create a learning and working environment where people feel like they can see themselves thrive and see a future for themselves, they will leave and go to the private sector or go elsewhere. So there are many examples in the report itself, but one example off the top of my head is those from a lower socioeconomic background or first generation students. So people who may be the first in their immediate family to attend higher education. The early stages of one's academic career, I think this is well documented, well known, is one that is often characterized by much lower salaries, unstable, precarious contracts, and that need to be, or also short-term project cycles or short-term funding, not a lot of stability in terms of career path. And oftentimes this needs to be supplemented by additional financial support, be it from people's parents or other family members or other work on the side. And it is at this kind of traction moment in your early research career where whether you come from a more affluent background can matter and really determine if you make it into tenure track. That's one example. Another example that comes to mind is of women. One quote that came to mind from an interview we had with a researcher in the US was that women are still confined to a certain role in the collective imagination in higher education, even despite all the progress that we've made in recent years. We were speaking to an endowed chair from a research university in the US, and many of her endowed chair colleagues or peers are white, much older men. And she told us the story that there were many, many circumstances where she found herself in meetings and her peers believed her to be there just to take notes, or that she was in the wrong meeting. And this is the moments where implicit bias like this can really affect someone's feeling of belonging in a space. So those are just two examples, but I feel over the course of this conversation, I will say more.
Before we go into some strategies, how the pipeline could be fixed, let's talk about something I was thinking. I read the article that is, by the way, posted on our website, Insights section, and you talk there about the importance of data for driving EDI initiatives. Could you elaborate on that? I think that's really interesting.
Of course, yes. So data is an interesting one. I think particularly as the world becomes more digitized, we're really acknowledging that data is the beginning and end to any problem. If you want to understand a problem, you need to collect data. And if you want to create an intervention that really targets the problem, you need data-informed solutions. And the same, of course, is true in EDI efforts in higher education. However, the sensitivity around the topics and the many barriers to data collection make it very difficult. I think in 2019, there was a survey of over 150 different universities in Europe, and they found that only or less than a third of the institutions had information about the ethnic or migration background of students. And this is, of course, can be related to lack of resources, having a survey of that scale, and also how to store this kind of sensitive information is quite a hurdle. Cultural sensitivities on the topics, psychological safety. Some people don't want to share this information with their employers, and sometimes for good reason. But the fact of the matter is that if you don't have available data on your staff and students, their lived experience, what's important to them, what's their experience being in your institution, you're not going to have even longitudinal data of policy measurement of how what you're doing right now is affecting your university community. And I think it can often result in what is often a critique of EDI efforts in universities, in that you can get very half-baked paper commitments where institutions commit to their EDI commitments, but it doesn't ring true to their university community. If you don't measure, you won't manage over time, essentially. So there's a lack of data to begin with. And when data is collected, if it is at all, it certainly lacks a lot of detail. So it's typically on gender or age, and rarely is it on ethnicity or socioeconomic background. I know for the case of disability, it's usually just a yes/no box on disability, and that is such a wide berth to put on that one topic, and it hinders your institution's ability to design inclusive work and studying environments if they don't really know what it is that their university community needs. It also does knock-on effects in terms of data interpretation, but you can see that when data is used to inform policies, that you can have some really successful examples, like certain accommodations can be made for, say, working mothers who have come back from maternity leave. Do they need new lactation rooms? Are there postponements of deadlines and time for promotion in case of staff parental leave? Or, as I mentioned, more accessibly designed workspaces. So it is a tough one. There are examples of organizations, and one comes to mind in Ireland, Inclusio, that has been around, I think, for the last few years. And it's a third-party organization that, similar to any kind of charter, employees may feel more safe, more comfortable giving their data to a third party and not directly to their employer. And they can then create a matrix and measure psychological safety, belonging, cultural change in that university, and see also how they can improve. So it's a difficult one. It's one that we're beginning to see the tide change. I know Ireland just recently required that universities gather more data on their students and staff in terms of their ethnic background. So it's something we're seeing more of, I would say.
I guess this is one of the, let's say, pathways towards more EDI or more successful EDI initiatives. What I hear from understanding to not having assumptions, but real understanding how to guide it. What could be some other strategies that academic institutions could employ to improve the stage of EDI?
There are many. I think one that is good to focus on, I don't want to call it low-hanging fruit, but I think it's one that's been around for a long time, is putting changes at the recruitment stage in terms of standardized interview training, anonymization of job applicants, both in terms of name, address, photograph, name of their alma mater, gender neutral text in advertisements. These are all things that have been around for quite some time, but to be honest, are not always rolled out on an institution-wide basis. It can differ depending on faculty or department. And we know that when a non-diverse body makes decisions about candidates, there's a tendency then for those people to reproduce the natural biases of the group to which they belong. And recognizing that this is unconscious bias, that there's not going to be a scenario where we suddenly have no bias or prejudice against anyone, but that with also unconscious bias training, you can really teach yourself to recognize those. And particularly if you're in that position of influence or power where you're asked to be on an interview panel where you can exercise that. One example, this is not an example in higher education, but it's an example that has been around for a long time, and I think it's an interesting one, is the example of blind auditions in orchestras in the 1970s. I believe this was in the US, where they found the 1970s at that point, I think less than 5% of orchestras, there were fewer than 5% women in orchestras, and they introduced blind auditions where candidates would audition behind a screen, and took it a step further and asked candidates to remove their shoes so that you couldn't hear if it was a man's shoe or a high heel coming in to perform. And research found that after that step, just having a preliminary audition where you could not see who it was made it 50% more likely that a woman would advance to the final round. So these are really clear ways where you can improve it, and just at the beginning stage of recruitment, and really steer towards a target of having more diversity in your pipeline.
Great, thank you. And maybe we can come back to some of more case studies or success stories, but we have a question in the audience here from Susanna. So she is asking, do you feel like universities should be open to people with different kind of degrees and or different experiences? And if so, how should that systemic change be best guided?
Oh, that's a great question, Susanna. I will answer personally and say yes, I do feel like they should be open to people with different kinds of degrees or experiences. I think when you look back to how universities began and you look at like the historical colonial aspect of it, in that universities were never intended to be as open as they were today. Oftentimes they were only open to white, highly educated sons of landed gentry members. And what the openness that exists today, I'll say quote unquote openness, would have been unimaginable at that time. And I think you have to continue to be ambitious with EDI, because it can be very easy to be complacent about something like this, particularly when you make it. I also like to emphasize that compositional diversity is very important. It is not the goal, however, or not the primary goal, because when you focus on numbers, I think you can really remove yourself from the understanding that this is a massive cultural change from what universities began as. And I know Ramanta and I were talking a few weeks ago about cultural change in another aspect of higher education, about external engagement and how to move that process along. So in terms of what you're asking about how to guide it best, I think those sort of cultural change, those tips really ring true for any kind of cultural change. Like EDI is sometimes seen as a different beast. And in cases of like cultural sensitivities, it is. But in terms of how to manage it, I think it is actually very similar. You have your same leadership buy-in, leadership commitment, those who have access to budgetary line and access to allocating resources. You need them on your side. You need them to be involved, not having it marginalized or on the margins. You need to embed these efforts in your institutional strategy, in your institutional goals, and it be seen to be a commitment from the institution side. But equally, you need bottom-up champions. You need people on the ground who are going to champion this effort for you and have people be involved. So it isn't also seen as a dictatorial thing. You want to integrate these efforts into every facet of academic life. So it's not just seen as, oh, this is the EDI event we do one year where we welcome people with different degrees or different experiences. I don't know if that's a very clear answer to your question, Susanna, but those are my thoughts on it for now.
Thanks, Madeline. And Susanna, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to pop them in a chat. So yes, I know you collected some case studies, maybe something that stood out for you as a great one. Share with us.
not even one as a great one, but I think is certainly a good, because I think it's also, and I myself am a victim to this, it's sometimes a lot easier to talk about the challenges than it is to talk about the supporting mechanisms and what is already out there and what is working. One thing that we came across, one of the partners in this research initiative is Trinity College Dublin. So we had a lot of examples from Ireland and also from the UK on what's going on in the realm of EDI in higher education. And one example that kept bringing up was the Athena Swan Charter. So charters and award schemes, positive reinforcement measures that universities can implement. And the Athena Swan example is, this is a very large scale charter that you can apply to, but it requires a lot of cross-institutional collaboration, a lot of measurement, and more importantly, a lot of not even just maintaining, but improving progress over time. So we heard from interviewees, it really encouraged a lot of cross-institutional collaboration and also encouraged institutions to take initiative and begin measuring things that maybe they hadn't before with the view to receiving a gold or a bronze, silver, or gold Athena Swan for their department, for their institution. And that kind of checking the pulse of the institution through that regular monitoring is, just good practice in any kind of effort, I think, but really showed, was something that was brought up by interviewees as something that had really spurred them on. And similar to that, I would say, talking maybe above an institutional level, but more like international, is that Horizon research applications require gender equality plans. And that is just a small nudge that we heard even from other interviews in Italy and Portugal. That was maybe the sole reason that their institution took initiative to get a steering committee together and work on a gender equality plan. And there is, of course, the critique that, if it is a top-down thing from the commission or a top-down from the government, then the institution may show less initiative to follow up on it or make it a continuous process. But having that initial foot in the door, I think, is crucial.
Everything starts with just like raising awareness. But it resonates so much what you're saying just about change in general and focusing on positive aspects. Maybe a last question, because we are suddenly at the end of the session. So what is your vision? You already mentioned there were great strides, but let's say in the next decade for this field.
I would love, of course, to see more diversity in leadership positions, for people to enter in a university as students and see themselves represented in the leadership of their university and feel a connection to that and be able to see themselves also, represented in those roles. We know that it takes time, particularly, I'm going to use the example of gender in fields like engineering, where you really have to plant the seed from the moment that young girls are choosing what subjects to study at 15 for their end of high school exams. That is where the seed needs to be planted, because if you don't put in that effort there, it's not going to carry through, and you have an ever decreasing pool to pull from for leadership roles. So it's a long-term effort. But in terms of my vision, you want graduates to graduate who are both skilled and also believe in their ability to reach their ambitions. And I think training people, educating people on what EDI is, the benefits of it, why it's important, and understanding that change in this regard is good. If the purpose of the university was just to advance itself, it would continue to reproduce itself and the same people that has gone before. And having this kind of change can only mean good for research excellence, for more diversity of perspectives and people.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. So thank you everyone for participating. We also have a range of more long-form events such as workshops, how-to sessions, as well as training programs where you can learn practical skills to apply in your own work. And UIIN members get complimentary access and discounts to these services. So head to our website to find everything about it. And lastly, please save the date to our conference in Amsterdam, June 10 to 12, 2025. The weather will be great. The call for abstracts is now open, so you can browse through our website and learn more about the conference subthemes and submission types. The deadline for this is the 20th of December. And then lastly, Madeline, where can people find out more about this initiative and in general your work, and how can they reach out to you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, but if you're interested in hearing more about the project, you can find that also on LinkedIn, ulead4all, or our website, ulead4all.eu.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ramante. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thank you for listening to the discussion. Follow UIN on LinkedIn, and if you're enjoying our podcast, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review on your podcast platform of choice to help others find this content too.